Welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, where we celebrate the craft of poetry. Each week we feature interviews with incredible poets, songwriters, and artists, including Olivia Gatwood, Safia El Hilo, Dana Joya, and many more. We also feature periodic submitted poetry episodes. Visit viewlesswings.com to submit your original poetry. I'm your host, James Moorhead, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California, and author of Canvas, Portraits of Red and Gray, and The Plague Doctor. Hit subscribe and follow me on Instagram or Threads at viewlesswings. Born in Toronto to Filipino immigrants, Jerome Barizo is a poet, essayist, librettist, and multidisciplinary artist. She is the author of 2 books of poetry, Tender Machines, Tupelo Press 2023, and The Cumulus Effect. A finalist for the Grey Wolf Nonfiction Prize and the 2023 Megaphone Prize, her work has been anthologized in books published by W. W. Norton, Atelier Editions, and Harvard University Press. Recent writings appear in Poetry, Plowshares, Esquire, Los Angeles Review of Books, Paris Review Daily, Boston Review, Book Forum, among others. As a librettist, she is the inaugural recipient of Opera America's Idea Residency, given to artists who have the potential to shape the future of opera. Her monodrama, ISOLA, will have its world premiere at Long Beach Opera in 2024, and Unbroken, commissioned for Opera Theater of St. Louis, will be premiered in 2024. She is also the recipient of fellowships and awards from Bennington College, Mellon Foundation, Opera America, Jerome Foundation, and Poets House. She is on the MFA faculty of the New School and lives in New York City. Jerome, welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast.
Thank you. Really happy to be here today.
Very excited to discuss your book, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading not only once but twice. And as summarized in your bio, you've explored the literary arts in many forms. What is it about poetry that attracts you to that art form?
Well, I would have to say that I can't pick favorites when it comes to literary forms, but poetry does happen to be the one right now that is most prevalent in my life. As you may have read, I grew up as a classical musician. During that time, I did write poetry all the time since I was a child. So I think that my interests in music and poetics, they've really been interwoven very seamlessly throughout my childhood and adulthood and my career. So I do think that because I was the performer for so long, that I got a little bit overwhelmed with always the exterior, right? Being on the stage and performing. So poetry is my way, I think, of nurturing that inner speaker that I felt I neglected for a long time.
Well, both my parents are classical musicians. And
that's amazing.
Yeah, so I can relate to the musicality of poetry and the being surrounded by music. So I think that poetry can capture rhythm and emotion in a way that's very different from prose and in a very much more compact way. So yeah, I can relate to that intersection between music and poetry very directly. Well, the poems in Tender Machines are so rich in strangeness, yet light, with empty space playing a powerful role. Many of the lines made me think of haiku, lines such as, "A flaccid white fish against my brown cheek," and "Eyelash petals, a blue sock, unravels at the heel, pulling, fast as lids fall." How did you achieve such consistency of voice in this collection during the revision and editing process?
I think that as a poet, I have these 2 impulses, and one of them is to be very talkative and superfluous, and the other one is kind of tending to this quieter minimalist aesthetic, right? So it's funny that those two sections that you read, they are writing from someone who is just waking up from sleep.
Mm.
Right. So there's something that, in music also, or any of the senses really, this idea of a distillate, right? So I always think of language like, how do I find this purest essence of language? And I think also my first book, which I think was much more minimalist actually, but I'm attracted to that, and also, some of my literary mentors like Jean Valentine. I feel like, and some work by Timothy Liu, very pared down language, pared down to this concentrate.
I think that's the essence of poetry that makes it so wonderful in my mind is getting to the least number of words, syllables, even letters to convey an idea with incredible power. And it's just, I think with prose, there's really, really good writers think about being that too, to a degree, but there's an element of prose that demands that you be more expansive. So I think that's what makes poetry so beautiful. Well, you already mentioned music as an influence, and I pulled out a couple of musical references present in your collection, including "My lungs grow black lilies while I play Bach's Ich ruf zu dir," and "White cool of milk, wine, of street machines, Schubert steepling in my ear," and one more, "She will be a string plucked on the inside of a piano." So how do you believe your musical training has influenced the writing of poetry?
I think in a few ways, um, you know, poetry can be this communication of the quotidian as well, right? And my quotidian is always surrounded by music, from morning to night. When I was at conservatory, just sometimes we would practice 6 to 8 hours a day. And so much of my childhood, that was kind of like the piano and the violin. They were my most constant companions, I would say. So I think it's just natural that they show up in my work. But I think that the two ways that music has really influenced me is this idea of discipline, right? Because I feel like writing is also a discipline,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's a practice, it's a creative practice, but it takes rigor actually. Discipline is one thing, and the other thing is form,
Mm-hmm.
right? So in music and poetry, is kind of saturated in form, right? You think of fugues or sonata form, and then sonnets, haiku, as you mentioned before. I feel like I have a bending towards form. I feel comfortable writing in form, but because I feel comfortable, it also allows me to break out of form or to kind of deconstruct or reimagine form when it allows.
Yeah, and I think I have an example in a little bit of you breaking out of potentially breaking out of form, but I'll come back to that. So that's a great setup. Well, the quote by Sylvia Plath that prefaces the collection and the opening lines of the first poem, The Mothers, sets the tone. You write, "We must be the inviolate petals, always queering towards the sun, must be water on the lips of flaming cities, quenching the husbands, insatiable." How did you approach, by the way, I love that opening. I think that's wonderful. How did you approach organizing this collection, the decision to have sections, and choosing this poem to open the book, which I thought was a well thought decision to open the book with that poem and those lines?
Well, thank you. So, I mean, as a poet, I am a constant reviser. And, some of these books, they were written over 2 decades, I would
Mm-hmm.
say, after 9/11 and then, recently. So imagine how many revisions a book can go through in 2 decades. I think that it really was important for me to ground this idea of women and women as caretakers, and also some of these kind of unsung voices of my ancestors. And so I did want to ground that first section in these voices of the mothers, the Sunday woman, the grandmothers, right? So that was one of the things that helped me really, begin to structure this manuscript.
And did you do the exercise that so many poets do? You had one room in your house with the entire book printed out and placed on the floor or stuck to the wall. Many of the poets I've talked to, including myself, that's one of the mechanisms. I don't find I edited the book structure in digital form. I had to print it out and see it and physically move it in space. What was your method for sort of knowing, moving it around, moving the poems around in space?
I did print them out, but I don't, maybe it's because my floor is not big enough. I don't know if I put all the pages out. But the sections, some of them like Tender Archive, which is all like very short minimalist poems, they kind of came all together, right? So there's also a chronological thing that was happening, like Tender Archive, those were all written within the space of maybe 1 or 2 months. And then small essays on disappearance, that longer section, it also came out all at once. So there's also this kind of chronological or thematic ordering that was going on.
Well, poems including, and you mentioned the shorter poems, The Cat, Jet Lag, Exit Music, and Coda, which you're going to read later, are so slight, just a few lines each, and demand to be reread. In Jet Lag, you write, morning scaled the window, pills stacked in the mouth, sandcastles. Your finger, lightsaber. Sickness needled the air. Even the window went pale, squinting at the gold teeth of the sun. I've asked several guests on the podcast about the challenge of writing short poems. How do you know when a poem is just enough?
That's such a hard question because I think that it's not necessarily me that knows, but the poem. But even something like this went through so many revisions, like capitalizations or periods or no periods. I think there was one iteration, there was no punctuation at all. But, for this poem, 6 lines, it was almost like it could fit into that window, right? That is in the first line, morning scaled the window. What is it that can fit into that space between dream and waking when it's like darkness and first light? So that there is not really, the narrator is not very present, right? Morning scales the window, morning becomes a character. And then at the end of the 6 lines, there's that squinting, the opening of eyes, squinting at the gold teeth of the sun.
Yeah. No, I think that you captured something there, that the poem is what is demanding where it's going, and the poet is almost on a hunt for the poem inside empty space. And also that that I think you also made a point that I think, poetry done well, it looks so effortless, but the reader has no idea how much work goes in even to a short poem. And short poems can even be more work in some ways than longer poems because every piece of it is so exposed. So I love the way you articulate that. The Women, which you'll read later, works beautifully as a prose poem. In rereading the poem, I can see edits that could take the poem into different forms, a sonnet being one form. And you mentioned this before, how you like playing with form. And how did you approach finding the ideal form? How do you approach finding the ideal form for your poetry in general, and which might be similar to the last answer, and for this poem specifically?
So it's interesting because many of these poems the poems that they, how you see them in the book were not their original form. Right? A lot of them had long lines and were almost like free verse, right? Little punctuation. And then in the editing process, and this really did happen subconsciously, I found that many of them had transformed into sonnets, which incidentally was the first form that I ever fell in love with as a child. And that I had not written in many years. I had not written sonnets. But when I was a teenager, I wrote them religiously. It was kind of my practice. The first that I felt familiar with. I memorized like Shakespeare's and Elizabeth Barrett Browning's and St. Vincent Millay's. Those are my first forays into poetry. So it's really interesting that these poems that I had written in free verse suddenly found themselves in this. I would say like a sonnet is almost like a little room, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or a song. So it's another case of the poem kind of knowing how it's going to look and how it's going to feel. And now I couldn't imagine any of these poems a different way, actually.
Mm-hmm. No, I can relate to that. There's when I went through the editing for my most recent book, The Plague Doctor, the editor that I was working with, Christina Marie Darling, actually at Tupelo Press, observed a couple of times the form could tweak. In one case, she said, "This is really a beautiful prose poem," and I removed all the enjambment and didn't really change much, maybe a word or two here or there. And then I was, oh my goodness, it is. It's been sitting there all along. That's what the poem is. Back to your earlier point, I just hadn't seen it, and someone else needed to see it. And then it worked really well in that form. Well, Small Essays on Disappearance is an arresting series of interconnected personal vignettes in the form of prose poems. Themes of motherhood, Manhattan, 9/11, and lines including, "I remembered years ago the quick slice of razors on wrists. What bliss. Red aligning on the eaves or beneath the skin." What a terrific line. How did you approach constructing, revising, and editing this interleave series of vignettes? Did this all come out at once and then you tightened it up, or was this done over a series of time?
I think they mostly came out during the same period of time. Perhaps it was, a few years after my daughter was born, I first became a mother. They really feel infused with this kind of physicality of motherhood, but also kind of remembrances of intense embodiment.
Mm-hmm.
But these two, I would say, went through a lot of just syntactical changes, like capitalizations, punctuation or no punctuation, and form, right? That last poem, like now all of them are kind of, almost one sentence poems, right? Or like monostitch, not all of them, but in the past, some of them had stanzas, right? But it seemed to me that kind of stream of consciousness that runs throughout this section, it kind of mirrored this all at onceness that I felt kind of as a new mother.
Well, and also the expectation set by saying small essays kind of puts you in the mind of visualizing something that looks more like an essay and less like a poem. Yeah. So that was really enjoyed that. Well, one more question before I hand the mic over to you. What is your approach to eliciting feedback about your poetry and determining which feedback you should do something about and which feedback you should set aside and ignore?
That's interesting. Actually, while writing this book, I was quite active with a writing group. It had some wonderful poets it was kind of a constantly evolving group. So we always had different members and different poets come in, but poets that I remember being in the group were like Timothy Liu, Sharif Shanahan, Sam Sachs, Sarah Wetzel. So it was this kind of, we always had this constant loop of really beautiful feedback, right? So I think that's really important to me as a poet, to always have at least one or two people that know my work, but also most importantly, they know me as a person, and they'll know if I'm putting this, if I'm able to put this true self on the page. or we'll kind of call out if there's any bullshit happening on the page, I was never really a good workshop participant when I was younger because I was too shy, actually. I felt overwhelmed by having to remain silent while people I didn't know kind of debated about my work. As a teacher now, that's my one way of reimagining. How do I reimagine the workshop? Right? I never tell my students they have to stay silent. They're going to be active facilitators in their own workshop. They're going to tell us what kind of feedback they're looking for. They're going to tell us what kind of draft this is. And yeah, they'll tell us what they feel that they want. What do they want to accomplish in the poem? Right. So I think it's really important for us not to be voiceless as poets, right? To not eradicate voice. And part of that is having good mentors, but also knowing that it's also about empowerment, right? How can we make this voice speak, in a sense?
No, I love that you're allowing your students to be active guiders of the feedback they're getting, which is more likely to result in feedback that they can do something with and not as random. Well, now I'm going to turn the mic over to you to read selections from Tender Machines.
New York, November. Today, my restless, yellow leaves are thrashing through the wind. The air in the city is thick with fear and want, and every day the men and women start to build again. Our lives, as we keep track of them, are acted out in simple gestures, hand to mouth, a gasp, clear-cut kiss or not. Nothing harmful, nothing said. The things we never speak of are like the lost debris or yellow leaves in any city, any fall. But something tells us this is different. Maybe it's that sad, burnt scent without a name. Perhaps it's just New York, miles from where you are. All I can really be sure of these days are the words I write you from my crowded heart, and the yellow leaves, and the way one season meets the next, violently. The Woman. An evening of expected rain. Out the window, clouds lifted their skirts and the wind poured in. We were the mothers lingering over the dessert tray, placing the sweets in our mouths one by one. We were the soothers and givers, keepers of children and men. Those days, our skin bunched up at the bra line, eyelids gathering like crinoline as it folds. Yet standing there at the table, there was nothing in the world we were in want of, not even the loves that had escaped us. Whatever we suffered, we let go of willingly. To know we were not the same woman as before did not pain us. When the others spoke, their voices swept over us like bees hovering over lilacs. Outside, lights strobed over the Hudson. We watched a white boat riding the crest of a wave, headed to sea. We felt an ache we realized was happiness, almost unbearable. Coda. And what is it you hate? She asked. Bureaucracy. And what is it you love? He asked. Rivers. They walked and walked until all the colors faltered. They drank until even the grass felt ill. So many days, so few words, and when it was dawn, nothing but birds flew out of their mouths.
It's always so wonderful to hear poems read by the poet. Just this is my favorite part of every one of these interviews. Well, just a couple more questions. Tupelo Press makes wonderful editorial choices when selecting poets to add to their portfolio. What have you learned about your poetry from the experience of publishing Tender Machines with Tupelo Press?
Well, one thing that I'm just so thrilled by is just how this book feels and looks, right, in my hands. And I think that's one of the reasons why I love this press, is that I didn't even give them this cover image. I just said, I want a kind of city skyline, and I basically said, this is the kind of vibe that I that I want, and then they have this cover that is just the most actually exquisite thing that I could ever have imagined for it, and it matches the poems and my personality perfectly. So I think that it's wonderful to have a press also that's they're not heavy-handed in the editing process. I really felt like these poems were very much myself. It wasn't highly edited but so beautiful, like with the fonts and the typeset. So I think it's hard to find this kind of relationship actually with the press. Especially poets are very particular.
Yes.
So it really was wonderful that the process was so kind of easy and natural.
Wonderful. Well, finally, what are you working on now?
Well, your first question was like, why is poetry like the most important thing right now? And actually this year, it's been really exciting because I've seen two poetic works that I've worked on turn into operas. Right? A couple of weeks ago, or actually even 1 week ago, it was the world premiere of my first opera, ISOLA, which came out of a set of poems that explored this idea of the body as islands, and the way time collapses and expands. So it was really amazing to be able to see these poems, which I'd written by hand on scraps of paper, turn into this 1 hour theatrical, basically art installation. It was even choreographed by dancer, LA Dance Project founders Julia Eichten, and sung by soprano Ariadne Grief. It's been really wonderful to see the lives that poems can hold that one wouldn't have imagined, right? And then I have a second opera premiering next month at Opera Theater of St. Louis, UNBROKEN, which is more of a narrative story about motherhood and resilience. So I'm very excited about those projects. I'm a resident this month at the Brishnikov Art Center in New York City. Always very invested in my students at the New School, where I teach at the MFA program. So those are the things that have been, consuming my time and interests, and things that I'm very, very excited about.
Well, your work on opera is fascinating to me because my father was the head of music staff and chorus master for the Chicago Lyric Opera for many years. So I grew up, and my parents ran an opera company in Massachusetts when I was growing up. So I've been backstage. I've been an extra in their opera company on La Boheme and other things like that. And so I think that the something that people don't realize about opera until more recently with supertitles is how beautiful the language is. And I'm so happy that opera introduced supertitles a number of years ago, so that piece of opera, which is arguably the most complex art form of all, it has so many elements: theater, music, extraordinary music, language, ballet, just everything is all packed into this one elaborate art form that for a long time, the words, because a lot of the operas that are performed are not in English, or even if they're in English, the nature of operatic singing can make it difficult for an audience to truly capture every word. I'm just so happy that the words have been brought back.
Yeah. And also, it's been wonderful working with my collaborators, like composer Alyssa Weinberg, director George Miller. And so the premiere of ISOLA was at Long Beach Opera, which is just this wonderful forward-thinking, the oldest opera company, I believe, in California. And the only one this year to have a completely woman-led, woman creative team, like all the composers, librettists, choreographers, etc. But they even published this beautiful limited edition of the libretto as a set of poems, like a chapbook. So every audience member took this
wonderful.
I think that poetry, as you said, like opera is this perfect intersection of like two of my great loves in my life, music and verse.
Well, congratulations on everything you've accomplished and what you have coming up. And Jay May, I'd like to thank you for sharing your poetry and your voice on the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast today.
Thanks so much.
The Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast is written and produced by James Moorhead. You can follow me on Instagram, Threads, and YouTube at Viewless Wings. Hit subscribe to be notified of every episode of the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast and spread the word with your poetry community.